Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 19 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Ottawa Senators, in which the Sharks have won 6-3. They have now reached the 10-win mark of the season here, 19 games into the year, and for the first time since the end of October, which was the beginning of the Sharks' COVID situation, the Sharks have actually managed to win back-to-back games with wins over the Carolina Hurricanes a couple nights ago, as well as here tonight against the Ottawa Senators, who they are beating for the second and final time this season. Now, this game, like that first matchup against the Senators, actually was rather close. It might not look so at first glance at the scoreboard, because the Sharks would end up winning 6-3, but those were counting 2 empty net goals. Otherwise, this was a game that was never a larger lead than more than 1 goal throughout the entirety of it, besides right in the last couple of minutes because of the empty netters. Each time the Senators would be able to catch up, get that game-tying goal, and eventually even get the go-ahead goal before the Sharks would respond with their own game-tying goal and go-ahead goal to eventually win that game. So this was definitely a back-and-forth game. It was also quite fun to watch. Just the physicality was surprisingly high for a game between two teams that don't necessarily have much of a rivalry between them. Obviously, there is that Sharks-Ottawa connection with Erik Karlsson, so it's not like as much of two complete stranger teams like, let's say, the previous night against the Carolina Hurricanes, but still, there isn't usually a massive rivalry between these two teams, but there definitely was a lot going on, and it started off with that early fight between Middleton and Austin Watson. But getting into the game here in the first period, I would not say the Sharks were the better team. In fact, besides on the power play where the Sharks looked decently sharp and got some shots off, the Ottawa Senators were actually the better team in that first period, yet the game would actually be tied at 1 after 20 minutes, as the Sharks would get the first goal of the game from Matt Nieto, his first of the season, and the Senators would get their first goal of the game from former first-round pick from the San Jose Sharks back in 2017, Josh Norris, who moved over to Ottawa in that Erik Karlsson trade. In fact, he actually victimized Erik Karlsson a bit on this goal by getting the inside position on him and putting it past James Reimer. Into the second period, which ended up being a bit more of a seesaw, while the Senators, I would say, controlled the pace of that first period mostly, though certainly the Sharks were not completely out of it. In the second period, it started off with a lot of Senators chances, then it kind of shifted the momentum towards the San Jose Sharks through the middle parts of this second period until a Noah Gregor penalty would be taken on a Sharks power play, and then it just seemed to be completely taken away the momentum by the Ottawa Senators, and this period ended up being quite back and forth as well in terms of goals, as it would start off with a Tomas Hertl goal to take it the lead 2-1. The Senators would then come back to tie the game with a Brady Tkachuk goal, and then would take the lead with a Connor Brown goal before the Sharks would tie it up once again with a Nick Bonino goal, not just his first goal of the season, his first point of the season coming on the power play. So obviously a massive relief for him to be able to get that first goal, even though it came 19 games into the season. Hopefully we're not going to be waiting as long for his second point of the year. Into the third period we went, though. After 40 minutes, the game was tied at 3, and it was going to be an interesting situation to see which team would actually be able to get that go-ahead goal, and if that team would actually be able to hold a lead here, because those teams with leads thus far in this game weren't really doing a great job at holding them. And so about 11 minutes into that third period, the Sharks would get the go-ahead goal. That would be Timo Meier, his 7th of the year, as he continued his red-hot season. And the Sharks would actually be able to hold that lead. It ended up being a rather evenly played third period, and even in those last couple of minutes when the Senators would try and get that goalie pulled, the Sharks did a very good job at preventing the Senators from getting many chances there with the goaltender pulled, or even just in general in the last few minutes. And eventually, as I said, the Sharks would get those 2 empty netters from Couture and Middleton to win it 6-3. On to the lineups, we of course have the first line of Meier, Couture, and Balcers, which was once again the Sharks' best line here tonight. Timo Meier continues to just lead the way in dominant fashion for the San Jose Sharks. I don't think he was necessarily as great as he was against the Carolina Hurricanes, but he was still incredibly strong here tonight. He ended up with 3 points in tonight's game. That goal, obviously, which ended up being the game winner, as well as a couple of assists, now sitting at 18 points on the year, and that's not 18 points in 19 games, which would still be very good. That's actually 18 points in 14 games, because he missed 5 games this season with in the COVID protocol, so he's over a point per game. He's just been completely dominant for the San Jose Sharks. I believe the only games this season where he doesn't have a point, if I'm not mistaken, were those games where the Sharks were actually shut out, so he clearly is a massive part of the Sharks offense, and a massive part of this first line. But we also should say something about Logan Couture, who also had a pretty solid game here tonight, got the empty net goal, added an assist, and also now has 16 points on the season. Now, this ends up not being point per game because Couture has only missed one game on the year, so that's 16 points in 18 games, but still very, very good season thus far for the captain. And then finally, their line mate here, who is filling in for Jonathan Dahlen, who misses yet a second straight game here with that shoulder injury that he ended up sustaining against the St. Louis Blues. Balcers did very well in this particular role. Balcers has kind of had a strange season thus far this year. He's been snake bitten at times because he's had some great chances, but a lot of it also has to do with just his inability to be able to finish on a lot of the different plays. But he had a very nice game here tonight, actually made a beautiful pass that led to this Timo Meier goal that would end up being the game winner. So that was nice to see. As I said, the first line was just far and away the Sharks' best line here tonight. When it comes to the bottom three lines for the Sharks, I wouldn't say it was completely awful, but it wasn't necessarily all that great either. When it comes to the second line, there was obviously the Tomas Hertl goal, but like I said, against the Carolina Hurricanes, it was another game where Tomas Hertl, there were a few shifts where I thought he looked very good, but then there were just a few too many shifts that I thought he looked a bit like a passenger, you could say. In that first period, there just wasn't much going. In the second period, he did score that goal and had a couple other nice shifts, but a couple shifts that just weren't on. So I do want to see more consistency from Tomas Hertl throughout the season, because when it comes to point totals, he's still racking them up, but he hasn't necessarily been as dominant as a player like Timo Meier, when those two players are usually relatively close in terms of skill level. If not, you would definitely make the argument that Hertl is better than Meier, but that hasn't really been the case thus far this season. When it comes to his line mates, maybe you can point to them as being a bit more of an issue for Tomas Hertl. Barabanov, I thought, had an okay game here tonight, but nothing super blowing me away impressive, and Noah Gregor continues to just not necessarily be up to par after that great game he had against the Washington Capitals, who, by the way, I mentioned that Jonathan Dahlen sustained his injury against St. Louis Blues. It was actually against the Washington Capitals, but back to Gregor, after that great game against the Capitals, he actually just hasn't been nearly as great against the Carolina Hurricanes, and here tonight now against the Ottawa Senators. So hopefully Dahlen does return from that injury, maybe even just for this next game against the Toronto Maple Leafs on Friday, because right now Gregor's just not necessarily bringing a ton to this second line. With the third line, they actually managed to contribute another goal here tonight. They had that all-important goal in the previous game against the Carolina Hurricanes, the only Sharks goal in regulation in that particular game, from Kevin Labanc, and here tonight it is Matt Nieto. It was actually a very well-executed rush by the Sharks' third line, so that was nice to see, but kind of like in the previous game where they got that one goal but otherwise weren't super effective, that's kind of the case here tonight. It's nice that they're chipping in on the scoreboard, but I'd like to see a bit more of a consistent effort in the offensive zone from these three players. Then when it comes to the fourth line, we, as I mentioned, have Bonino getting his first point. Very, very nice. I do want to mention Scott Reedy. I thought he actually had a couple of nice shifts in the first period of this game. There was one in particular where he actually almost scored a goal. I believe this was a Brent Burns kind of shot pass that ends up cutting across the crease that Reedy almost is able to get a stick on but is unable to do so. But it's just kind of a situation where Reedy was not really given much of a look in tonight's game. I believe only played just over 7 minutes of ice time, which is, low even for a younger player on the fourth line. From Bob Booner's perspective, usually they could get at least like 9.5, but the fact that Reedy only ends up getting about 7 here tonight is kind of surprising. I suspect that Gregor will actually remain in the lineup if Dahlen is to return, and that would be the only change. Reedy would kind of just draw out of it, and Gregor would probably move to that fourth line with Cogliano and Bonino. Moving on to the defensive side of things, one player who in particular I do want to talk about, of course, is Erik Karlsson. Even though that Erik Karlsson trade from Ottawa was over 3 years ago at this point, Karlsson was just such an effective player for the Ottawa Senators when he was there that there's always going to be that extra eye kept on him in games between the Sharks and the Senators, and I still feel as though Karlsson kind of has more reason to get up in the morning when the Sharks are actually facing a team like the Senators compared to any other team at the NHL level. And here tonight for Erik Karlsson, it was kind of like a bit of a give and take game, I guess you could say. On the defensive side of things, there were a couple of massive errors. There was the one on the power play where he actually mishandles a puck at the blue line, which allows for a Connor Brown breakaway, which ends up with Barabanov slashing him. Surprisingly, not a penalty shot, ends up just being a penalty that would end up making it go to 4-on-4, and then a couple of other issues in the defensive zone. However, when it came to the offensive zone, Erik Karlsson showed off some pretty vintage Ottawa Senators Erik Karlsson there. He set up some very, very nice plays, none of them necessarily resulting in goals per se, but there were definitely some great chances that he managed to set up. Matt Murray had to come up with a couple of great saves on those opportunities against Erik Karlsson, or I guess against the players who Erik Karlsson would end up passing to. So at least on the offensive side of things, Erik Karlsson definitely did a lot for the Sharks here tonight. And another defenseman who I do want to mention here would actually be on the first pairing with Brent Burns, Mario Ferraro. This wasn't necessarily a super dominant performance from Ferraro. He obviously ended up being hemmed in his own zone a lot in this game. And you can say what you will about this particular stat, kind of like I mentioned a few games ago when I was talking about Mario Ferraro when it came to blocked shots. Ferraro once again continues to lead the league in terms of blocked shots for the San Jose Sharks, and here tonight he ends up racking up 7 blocks, and those mostly came early on in this game. So it just goes to show that even though this wasn't a perfect defensive night for Mario Ferraro, it's nice to see him continue to sacrifice the body for the cause of trying to win some games here. That's what, a young leader would do. And a lot of people I know like to talk about that Mario Ferraro is looking to potentially be a future captain on this team. And while I don't think Logan Couture is going to be going anywhere anytime soon, maybe 5-6 years down the line, if Mario Ferraro is still with the San Jose Sharks, and I imagine he will be, he could definitely be someone that the Sharks will look at to get that captaincy. And then finally, to talk about the goaltender James Reimer here, certainly not his best game of the night, of the season, I should say, but the Sharks did enough in front of him to get him the win anyway, managed to get him the goal support that he had been sorely missing in many previous games that he had actually played at this point this season. So finally, the Sharks kind of returned the favor to James Reimer on this first goal from Josh Norris, of course. I don't think he had that much of a chance on the second goal from Tkachuk. Also didn't really have much of a chance on, but it was obviously the third goal that looks pretty bad from James Reimer's side. This wasn't a classical bad goal in general. Like, this wasn't an Adin Hill against Connor Sherry back against the Washington Capitals style of bad goal. This was just kind of poor positioning, I guess you could say. Not necessarily positioning, but poor reading of the play. James Reimer thinks that this puck is actually getting passed across the ice, so he ends up sliding all the way to his right, but it actually just ends up going to Connor Brown in the slot, who ends up just pushing it into the pretty much wide open net at that point because James Reimer overcommitted to that pass that he thought was cutting across. He ended up losing a vision of the puck. So definitely a large mistake there from Reimer, but luckily the Sharks actually managed to bail him out in that situation, and I suspect Reimer will be able to rebound in his next start. Will that come against the Toronto Maple Leafs on Friday, or will Adin Hill draw back in? I'm not entirely sure. It honestly wouldn't surprise me if Adin Hill ends up getting the start, but I do suspect Reimer will indeed rebound when that next start does come. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action, as I said, against the Toronto Maple Leafs on Friday. This is another team who they are going to be playing for the second and final time this season. And the Sharks actually have a win against the Toronto Maple Leafs at this point. 5-3 was the score in that game. However, the Maple Leafs have been on absolute fire as of late, so the Sharks are going to have to be careful. At the time when the Sharks faced the Leafs, that team was still struggling, and so the Sharks managed to squeak out a victory there, 5-3. But now that the Leafs just seem to be firing on all cylinders and seem to have all gotten on the same page, it's going to be a much more difficult win to try and get out. Class dismissed.